When the Galactic Council betrayed humanity, the universe paid the price. The vote was already over before I walked into the room. I did not know that yet. I was standing at the human delegation table inside the Grand Conclave Chamber, looking out at 11 species seated in a half-circle of polished stone and cold light. The chamber was enormous. It was designed to make you feel small, and for the first time in 40 years of serving Earth's diplomatic corps, I let it work. My name is Ilara Voss. I was the chief human ambassador to the Galactic Council. I had spent my entire adult life in this building, in rooms like this one, negotiating, persuading, compromising. I had shaken hands with creatures who had 6 limbs, no eyes, or bodies made of dense compressed gas. I had smiled when I wanted to argue. I had stayed quiet when I wanted to shout. I had done everything asked of me, and I had done it because I believed the Council was worth believing in. That belief ended the moment High Chancellor Vrethka opened his mouth. He did not look at me when he spoke. That was the first sign. Vrethka was a tall, silver-skinned Lorath with 4 narrow eyes and a voice like grinding stone. He had always acknowledged me at the start of sessions. It was a small courtesy, but he had never skipped it in 12 years. Today, his gaze went everywhere except the human table. The Council recognizes the special session on Council Directive 7 Omega, he said. I had not been told about any Directive 7 Omega. I looked at Lena Burke, my second-in-command, seated to my left. She was already pulling up the directive on her data pad. I watched her face go from confusion to something I had never seen on Lena before. She was one of the calmest people I had ever known. She had laughed during a hull breach drill, but right now, reading whatever was on that screen, she had gone completely still. She slid the pad to me without a word. The Edict of Containment. I read it once. Then I read it again because the first reading did not fully process. It was 14 paragraphs of formal Galactic Council language, but the meaning was simple and absolute. Humanity was being reclassified as a Tier 0 hazard species. All human colonial holdings beyond the Sol system were to be seized and placed under Council administration. The human expeditionary fleet was to be disarmed and decommissioned within 90 days. Earth itself was to be placed under a permanent orbital quarantine, managed by a Council peacekeeping force. The justification: humanity's uncontrolled biological aggression and unchecked exponential adaptability posed a systemic threat to galactic stability. We had fought in every war the Council asked us to fight. We had sent food and engineers to 3 species that would have collapsed without our help. We had given them navigation technology, medical advances, and terraforming knowledge that we had developed at enormous cost, and we were a threat to galactic stability. I stood up. Chancellor Vrethka, my voice was level. I had trained it to be level. He finally looked at me. There was no hostility in his expression. That was somehow worse than anger. It was the look of someone who had already moved on to the next item on a list. Ambassador Voss, he said, the vote has been entered into the record. The vote has not been presented to the full chamber, I said. It was presented in closed session last night. I felt Lena's hand close briefly on my arm under the table. A warning, keep steady. Humanity was not notified of a closed session, I said. Humanity was not a voting party in this matter. He held my gaze, and for the first time I saw something move behind those 4 narrow eyes. Not guilt, not regret, certainty. The motion passed 11-0. 11 species, 11 votes, not 1 dissent. I turned to look at the Dravvosi table. Ambassador Prika, a short, blue-scaled diplomat I had worked alongside for 9 years, was looking at the floor. His people had been our closest allies. I had personally negotiated the trade agreement that kept his home planet fed through 3 consecutive drought years. He did not meet my eyes. He had abstained. The word that came to my mind was not anger. It was clarity. This had been planned for a long time. The closed session, the pre-submitted vote, the complete silence from our one ally, none of this was improvised. This was a trap built while we sat at their table and trusted them. While we sent our soldiers to die in their wars and our engineers to rebuild their worlds, They had been writing the paperwork to put us in a box. I gathered my documents from the table. I took my time doing it. I refused to move quickly. I refused to give anyone in that room the satisfaction of watching a human scramble. "This is not a legal directive," I said, loud enough for the recording systems to catch every word. "It violates 7 articles of the Council's own founding charter. Humanity does not recognize it, does not accept it, and will not comply with it." I looked directly at Vrethka. "And when this is over, Chancellor, I want you to remember something. You had a choice today. You chose this." I walked toward the chamber exit. 2 council security officers stepped in front of the doors. They were large Velhari, built like walls, with full armor and neural disruptors on their belts. I stopped. "Ambassador Voss," Vrethka said from behind me, "you will be held in diplomatic detainment pending the transition period." I looked at the 2 guards, I looked at the disruptors, and then I did something that I suspect confused them greatly. I smiled. They walked me to a holding cell on the station's lower ring. It was clean and small, with a cot, a filtered air vent, and a single light strip overhead. The door sealed behind me with a soft, final click. I sat on the cot. I did not panic. I did not shout. I placed my hands flat on my knees and I breathed slowly and I began to count. Not seconds, not steps to the door. I counted resources. I counted people. I counted the number of calls I had made over the past decade that had nothing to do with diplomacy. The favors accumulated quietly by people who had stopped believing this day would never come. Inside the lining of my diplomatic badge was a transmitter no larger than a grain of rice. It had been sewn in there 8 years ago by a man named Adrian Cross, who worked officially as a communications technician for Earth's embassy. It had one function, one signal, one word. I pressed the badge against the cot's metal frame, using the contact to complete the circuit. The signal was so small that no scanner in the station would read it above background noise, but it only needed to travel as far as the nearest relay, and from there, it would jump across 6 encrypted channels until it reached someone who was waiting for it. The word was simple. Ragnarok. I set the badge down on the cot beside me. The light hummed steadily overhead. Somewhere out in the dark, things were already beginning to move. I thought about Vrethka's expression when he told me the vote had passed. That absolute certainty. That complete confidence that humanity was finished. Every civilization that had ever underestimated us shared one flaw. They looked at what we showed them and assumed that was everything we had. They counted our visible ships and called it our fleet. They counted our registered colonies and called it our territory. They read our diplomatic files and called it our strategy. They never once considered that a species which had survived ice ages, plagues, and centuries of conflict with itself might have learned a very specific lesson. The lesson was this: you do not put everything on the table, you keep something back, always. No matter how much you trust the room, you keep something back. The Galactic Council had spent 40 years studying humanity. They had read our history, analyzed our biology, and mapped our psychology. They had concluded that we were dangerous enough to contain but not clever enough to anticipate. They were half right. The guard rotation on the lower ring happened every 4 hours. I knew this because I had memorized the security protocols of every council facility I had ever visited. Not because I expected to need that information. Because I was human, and humans do not stop studying a room just because the room seems safe. The second rotation had just changed when the vent cover on the far wall moved. It moved slowly, deliberately, with the careful patience of someone who had practiced the motion many times. The cover came away without a sound, and from the dark crawlspace beyond, a face appeared. A human face. Young, angular, with short dark hair and a long scar running from the left ear to the jaw. "Ambassador Voss," he said quietly. "I'm Ian Ford, you don't know me." "I know exactly who you are," I said. "You have been stationed on this facility for 11 years under the name Kale Dorn, Velhari Maintenance Crew, 3rd Shift." He blinked. "How did you?" "Adrian Cross and I have worked together for a long time," I said. He told me you were here 3 years ago, just in case. Are we ready? Ian pulled himself through the vent opening and dropped silently to the floor. He was wearing a Velhari maintenance uniform, which was clever, because Velhari are large enough that the uniform hid his entire body shape underneath the padding. He handed me a matching set. Signal went out 11 minutes ago, he said. Cross confirmed receipt from the Sol relay 14 seconds later. Ragnarok is active. I pulled the uniform on over my clothes. What is the route? Service corridor to the docking ring. There is a cargo hauler registered to a Loreth freight company, but the crew are all ours. Clara Webb is flying. She has been docked here for 6 days waiting. Clara Webb was one of the best pilots I had ever seen operate in confined space. She had once navigated a rescue shuttle through an active debris field using nothing but manual controls and a cracked viewport. If she was waiting, we were going to be fine. Ian led me through the vent system with the quiet confidence of someone who had memorized every turn. We did not speak. We moved through the station's mechanical underside, past heat exchangers and coolant pipes and the constant low vibration of the station's artificial gravity systems. We made it to the docking ring in 22 minutes. Clara was in the cockpit of a battered-looking cargo hauler that had no markings worth reading. She gave me a single nod as I came aboard, and before Ian had sealed the rear hatch, the ship was already running undock sequence. We have about 8 minutes before they notice you're gone, Clara said. 14 before they lock the departure lanes. How long to the relay point? 6 minutes at full burn. Then burn. She burned. We cleared the station's docking arms, and Clara pushed the engines to a level that made the hull creak. The conclave station fell behind us, and I watched it through the cockpit glass until it was just another light among lights. I spent those 6 minutes at the communication console. I had messages to send, and not much time to send them. The first message went to Nate Price, admiral of what the official records called the 2nd Expeditionary Reserve, and what I privately called the most important thing humanity had built in 50 years. It contained 2 lines. Ragnarok is live. Proceed to Phase 1. The second message went to a private address that had never been registered on any council network. It went to a woman named Asara, a Dravosi admiral who had been officially retired for 4 years after a very public disagreement with her government's foreign policy. She had contacted me 2 years ago through a series of steps, so indirect that by the time her message reached me, it had passed through 7 different channels and 3 dead drops. She had said one thing. If the day ever comes, I have 40 ships and I am ready to use them. My message to Asara was one word. Now. We hit the relay point. Clara made the jump. The stars stretched and snapped, and we came out on the other side of council space in a location that did not exist on any official chart. And there it was. I had helped build it over the course of 15 years, and I had never seen it from the outside before. The base was embedded inside a dark asteroid cluster, invisible to standard sensors, powered by a cold fusion grid that produced almost no heat signature. It was ugly and practical and enormous, and hanging in the dark around it, arranged in quiet, patient rows, were the ships. Not dozens, not even hundreds. 340 warships, 120 support vessels, 60 specialized assault platforms, and a carrier the size of a small moon that we had been building in sections for 8 years, and had only finished assembling 11 months ago. Every ship was crewed, fueled, and armed. Every crew member had volunteered by signing a document that removed them from the official census. They had done it knowing they might never return to normal life. They had done it anyway. This was Project Ragnarok. This was what 30 years of quiet preparation looked like. I had stood in front of 3 different Earth Councils and 3 different defense committees and made the same argument each time. We should trust the Galactic Council, yes. We should pursue peace, absolutely. And we should also prepare for the day they betray us, because history, both human and galactic, showed one consistent pattern. Power concentrates, and concentrated power eventually turns on whoever it considers a threat. 3 committees had told me I was being paranoid. The fourth had given me a black budget line and looked the other way. I walked through the carrier's main corridor to the command center, and the crew I passed stood straighter without being told to. They had been waiting. They were ready. And they were determined in the contained, purposeful way that humans get determined when they have been patient for a long time and have finally run out of patience. Nate Price met me at the command center door. He was a tall, lean man in his late 50s with gray at his temples and a handshake that could crack stone. He had been my first commanding officer when I was 23 years old and he had been 40. He had taught me that the difference between a threat and a promise was follow-through. Every blockade ship within range of the outer colonies, I asked before he could speak. Navigation systems locked on all 12, he said. Remote lock engaged 40 minutes ago. They cannot move, fire, or communicate on standard channels. Casualties? None. The lock is clean. They are just sitting there. I breathed out once. That mattered. We were not starting this by harming people who were following orders. What is the status of the colonies themselves? His expression shifted, just slightly, just enough. 9 colonies are secure. We had operatives on the ground who moved fast. He paused. 3 colonies in the outer belt were hit before the lock engaged. Council advance units. We lost contact. 3 colonies. The number settled into me like weight. How many people? We are still counting. He said it quietly. We think around 4 million. I stood with that for a moment. I let it be real. I did not push it aside or reduce it to a tactical variable. 4 million people who had been living their lives on worlds they had built with their own hands. They had not been soldiers. They had not been part of any plan. They had just been human. I made a decision in that moment that I kept for the rest of everything that followed. I would carry those 4 million names as weight, not as fuel. I would not use them to justify cruelty. I would use them to make sure it never happened again. Phase 2, I said. Nate nodded and turned to the command console. Phase 2 was the part that would get complicated. 3 days before the conclave session, I had sent a message to every personal contact I had cultivated over 40 years of diplomacy. Not ambassadors, not government officials, individuals. A Silhari engineer who had spent 6 months on an Earth station and gone home saying that humans were the strangest and most generous people he had ever met. A Loreth medical researcher whose daughter had been treated at a human hospital when their own facilities could not help her. A Dravvosi historian who had dedicated her career to documenting the Council's hidden record of species suppression. People who owed nothing to the Council and something to us. Those people were now moving. They were sharing documents, making transmissions, and doing something far more dangerous and far more effective than anything my fleet could do. They were talking. I had been in enough political rooms to understand one truth about power. You cannot stop an idea. You can suppress it, delay it, complicate it, but once it reaches enough ears, it becomes structural. It changes the way people think, and when enough people change the way they think at the same time, governments collapse without a single weapon being fired. We were not there yet, but we were moving toward it. A transmission came in on the private channel. I had messaged 2 hours earlier. Asera. Her image appeared on the screen. She was older than the last photograph I had seen of her, with silver streaks in her dark blue scales and a steadiness in her expression that comes from years of hard decisions. She did not give a long speech. I have 43 ships, she said. My crew knows the risk. We are with you. Tell me where to go. I told her. Then I walked to the observation window at the end of the command center and looked out at the fleet assembled in the dark. 340 warships, 43 Dravvosi vessels moving to join them, 12 Council blockade ships sitting frozen in space. The Council had built their entire strategy on the assumption that humanity was exactly what it appeared to be. That was always going to be their most expensive mistake. The Council's Grand Armada left Conclave Central 6 days after the vote. We knew this before they cleared their own docking clamps. Ian Ford was not the only human who had spent years embedded in Council infrastructure. We had people in fuel depots, supply chains, and communication relays across a third of Council space. When 600 warships power up their drives simultaneously, they do not do it quietly. We tracked every one of them from the moment the engines fired. 600 ships. It was the largest fleet the Council had ever assembled. Vrethka had clearly decided that if the threat was worth containing, it was worth containing completely. He wanted to make an example. We let him come. The approach to Earth runs through a navigational corridor called the Meridian Gate. It is not a physical structure. It is a gravitational lane, a stretch of space where the pull of 3 nearby star systems creates a natural pathway that makes travel faster and more fuel efficient. Almost every large fleet moving toward the inner human systems would use it. There was no reason not to. It was the obvious route. We had spent 4 years making it ready. I was on the bridge of our carrier, which we had named the Aliner, when the first Council ships entered the gate. My crew was calm. That impressed me more than any weapon. Every person on that bridge had looked at the numbers, understood what 600 warships meant, and chosen to show up anyway. Nate Price was at the tactical station to my left. Kate Sims, our chief weapons officer, was at her console with the precise, unhurried posture of someone who had rehearsed this moment so many times it had become ordinary. Paul Marsh commanded our forward division from his own ship 3,000 kilometers ahead, and I could hear his steady voice on the fleet channel running position confirmations with the quiet efficiency of someone calling out items on a checklist. First Council formation is in, Paul said. 240 ships in the vanguard. Let them come deeper, I said. We waited. The Council vanguard advanced through the gate, their formation tight and confident. From their perspective, they were flying toward a desperate, outnumbered resistance. They expected to find humanity scrambling. They expected fear. What they found instead was silence. The debris field at the center of the Meridian Gate was not natural. It looked natural. It had been arranged over the course of 18 months, using remote drone teams, to mirror the exact profile of the natural debris that had always existed in that corridor. Buried inside that debris, at intervals calculated to the meter, were gravity-anchored devices, not explosive devices. These created a localized gravity pulse on activation, strong enough to lock a ship's drive output into a feedback loop that took 8 to 12 minutes to manually reset. They did not destroy. They stopped. 57 Council ships were caught in the first pass. They did not explode. They simply stopped moving, dead in the corridor, their engines spinning uselessly against their own feedback. The Council vanguard had never seen this technology before. The tactical response was exactly what we had predicted. Confusion first, then a pullback order, which caused the rear formations to compress forward against the ships that were now stationary. The corridor, which was efficient for orderly movement, became a serious problem for chaotic movement. Into that confusion, we sent the drones. 3,000 autonomous drone units, each one a fraction of the size of a fighter, had been sitting cold and dark inside the debris field for weeks. They came alive simultaneously and launched outward in expanding arcs. Each drone carried a sensor profile that mimicked a full-sized warship. To the Council fleet's tactical systems, 3,000 ships had just appeared from nowhere. The Council fleet did what any disciplined military force does when facing overwhelming numbers. It tried to reform. It tried to find a defensible position. It tried to identify which contacts were real. While it tried, Paul Marsh led our actual forward division in from the flank. Our ships did not attack the Council fleet. They flew directly toward the Council flagships, targeting the external communication arrays, not to destroy them, to attach relay transmitters. This was the piece of the plan I was most proud of, and also the most demanding. 14 of our assault crews flew directly into a 600-ship armada and got close enough to physically attach hardware to enemy vessels. 6 of those crews did not make it back. I knew their names. I had shaken each of their hands before they launched. But the relay transmitters worked. Within 20 minutes of the engagement beginning, we had access to the internal communication channels of every Council flagship. Not to listen, to broadcast. I pressed the transmission key myself. What the Council fleet heard through their internal systems was not a threat. It was not a demand for surrender. It was voices. Hundreds of voices. Colonists from the outer belt, recorded in the hours after the advance units arrived at their settlements. Families who had lived on those worlds for 2 and 3 generations, describing what was happening to them in plain language, without exaggeration, because the truth was already extreme enough. Children's voices, old voices, the voices of people who had built something from nothing and were watching it being taken. I had chosen this specifically, not because I wanted the Council fleet to feel guilty. I chose it because I wanted the individual soldiers listening to understand what they were part of, not an abstract strategic directive, not a distant political decision. This is what that decision looks like when it arrives at someone's front door. The fleet channel went quiet in a way that military channels never go quiet unless something unexpected is happening. Then the first stand-down request came in. A Silhari destroyer, Commander Designation 479, requested permission to disengage from the Council order. 20 seconds later, a second ship, then a third. In 11 minutes, 31 ships from 3 different species contingents had formally requested to stand down. The Council Vanguard Admiral, a Velhari named Commander Roan, ordered all units to resume forward posture and treat ships that disengaged as non-allied. Roan was not a cruel officer from what I knew of his record. He was a disciplined, professional soldier following a directive from his government. I respected that even as I worked against it. Paul Marsh's division had reformed on the outer edge of the corridor. The secondary fleet, under Kate Sims' coordination, came in from the other side. The Council fleet was not surrounded. We did not have the numbers for that, but it was caught between 2 forces with an obstructed corridor behind it and a minefield it could not reliably map ahead. Roan was good. He identified the pressure points quickly and started moving his undamaged ships toward the gaps. If he had been able to maintain cohesion, he might have broken through. He did not get the chance. Our carrier, which had been holding at a distance, the Council fleet considered safely outside engagement range, moved forward. 6 Council warships turned to intercept. What they did not know was that the Aliener carried something we had spent 11 years and a significant portion of our black budget developing. We called it the resonance array. In simple terms, it broadcast a signal on the same frequency used by every Council ship's navigation processor. The signal did not damage the processors. It introduced 3 seconds of recalibration lag into every navigational decision. 3 seconds does not sound like much. In a complex, multi-ship engagement inside a narrow corridor, with obstacles, false contacts, and 2 opposing fleets operating simultaneously, 3 seconds is everything. The Council fleet lost formation. Ships that should have moved right moved late. Flanking maneuvers arrived out of sync. The coordinated pressure Roan was trying to build collapsed into individual ships making individual decisions without a working collective strategy to follow. We did not destroy those ships. We had been clear about this in every tactical discussion before the engagement. We were not there to end the lives of soldiers who had been told humanity was the enemy. We were there to stop them, hold them, and make the cost of continuing this action so high that someone with decision-making authority would choose differently. It took 4 more hours. When Roan's request for communication came through, I took it personally. He appeared on screen with the rigid posture of a man who was about to do something that went against every instinct in him. "Ambassador Voss," he said, "Commander Roan, Council Armada, requesting terms of disengagement." I kept my expression neutral. The terms are the same ones I stated before this engagement began. You disengage, return to Council space, and remain there until your government has answered for the Edict of Containment. No conditions beyond that. He was quiet for a moment. "My government has not authorized." "I know," I said. "That is between you and your government." He looked at me for a long moment. He was trying to find something in my face, I think. some sign of anger, or the kind of satisfaction that makes a victor unpredictable. I hope he did not find it. I was not feeling those things. I was feeling tired and certain and completely sure that this was the right path, even when the right path cost this much. Disengagement authorized, Roan said. The Grand Armada pulled back, not in disorder, in sequence. Roan ran a disciplined retreat, and I gave his retreating ships a wide, clear corridor to move through. No pursuit, no final action. When the last Council ship jumped out of the Meridian Gate, my bridge was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then Kate Sims said, without any particular drama, "That is a first in Council history." She was right. The Galactic Council had never lost a fleet engagement, not once in 300 years. Their military supremacy was so established that most species had stopped thinking of it as something that could be challenged. Today we had changed that assumption, not because we were more powerful, because we were more prepared, more precise, and more willing to think in ways our opponents had never considered. I stood at the observation window and watched the empty corridor where 600 warships had been an hour ago. We had won this battle. We had not won the larger conflict. There were 11 governments on the other side of this, each with resources, fleets, and political strength that dwarfed our own. The Edict of Containment was still on the record. The 3 destroyed colonies were still gone. 4 million people were still unreturned. But something fundamental had changed in the calculation of this conflict. They had believed we could be managed. Now they knew better. 3 days after Meridian Gate, the argument nearly tore us apart. It started quietly, the way the most dangerous arguments always do. Owen Cole, the head of Earth's Shadow Defense Council and the man who had originally authorized the black budget for Ragnarok, sent a transmission to the carrier. He wanted a tactical council, mandatory attendance. 31 people filled the Leaner's main briefing room. Admirals, fleet commanders, colony representatives, and strategists. I sat at the head of the table. Owen sat across from me, and from the moment he sat down, I could see what kind of conversation this was going to be. "We have their fleet in retreat," he said. "We have 11 species in disarray. Their communication networks are fragmented and their political leadership is scrambling. The window to press forward is open right now. In 4 weeks it will close." He put both hands flat on the table. "We should move on their core systems." The room divided exactly as I had expected. 8 commanders immediately agreed with Owen. 4 immediately disagreed. The remaining 19 watched me. "Define what you mean by move on their core systems," I said. "Occupation of the Conclave Station, blockade of the Loreth and Velhari home systems, forced renegotiation under military pressure." He said it clearly and calmly, because Owen Cole never stepped back from his own positions. "We have the momentum. If we stop now, they will regroup and come back with a strategy built around what they learned at the Meridian Gate. We will not get this advantage twice." He was not wrong about the tactical window. That was what made this conversation so difficult. Admiral Dean Harlow, one of my oldest and most trusted officers, leaned forward from my right. "He is right about the timeline. If we do not press, we lose the advantage. We spent 30 years building toward this moment, and we are considering stopping at the first success." "We lost 4 million people in the outer colonies," I said. The room went quiet. "Before we discuss any advance, I want us to be specific about what this conflict has already cost." "Which is exactly why we should not stop," Owen said. "Those 4 million people are the reason we cannot afford to give their governments time to recover and strike again." "And if we move on their core systems," I said, "we confirm every single thing they told their populations about us. We become the Tier 0 hazard species they warned everyone about. We give every uncertain government in the Council a reason to stop being uncertain and unite against us. We transform a coalition that is currently falling apart into one that has a new reason to hold together." Silence. I let it stay there. "There is a second option," I said. "We already used part of it at Meridian Gate. We have everything we need to use it fully." I looked at Ruth Kane, who was seated at the far end of the table. Ruth was not a soldier. She was a historian and intelligence analyst who had spent 12 years doing work that seemed unglamorous but proved to be the most significant contribution in this entire effort. She had been collecting documents. Council documents, classified, sealed, protected behind encryption systems that had taken our people years to access. Records going back 2 centuries. "Tell them what you found," I said. Ruth Kane stood up. She was a precise woman who did not waste words. "The Edict of Containment against Humanity is not the first one," she said. "It is the fourth. The first was issued 212 years ago against a species called the Marin. They were a highly adaptive, biologically complex species that the Council classified as a Tier 0 hazard after they developed faster-than-light travel independently of Council guidance." She paused. "There are no Marin left. The edict was fully carried out." The room was still. The second edict was issued against the Korath 80 years later, the same classification, the same justification. The Korath had 3 inhabited worlds. Their last recorded population was 11 individuals 60 years ago. Their current population is 0. She looked around the room. The third edict was issued 30 years ago against the Felhari. Most of you have never heard of them. That is the point. They were a species of 800 million across 2 systems. The official council record describes their extinction as the result of a natural pandemic. "And the documents you found," I said, "show that the pandemic was introduced deliberately, with full council authorization." The silence in that room was a different kind than I had experienced before. It was the silence of people processing something that changed the shape of what they were looking at. Owen Cole sat back in his chair. The calculation behind his eyes shifted, not because he had been hopping for something wrong, because he was a practical man who now understood that the tactical question had a much larger context. "If we occupy their core systems," I said, "we are the latest entry in a long line of military solutions. We win the immediate battle and spend the next 100 years managing a war. If we release these documents, we do not need to occupy anything. Their own populations do the work." "Can we rely on their populations to respond?" Dean Harlow asked. "I rely on individuals," I said, "not governments. The Silhari engineer who spent 6 months on Earth Station 14 and came home saying we were the most confusing and generous people he had ever encountered. I rely on him. The Dravvosi historian who has spent her career documenting what the Council buries, I rely on her. The 31 ships that stood down at Meridian Gate because their crews listened to the voices of our colonists, I rely on those crews." I looked around the table. "We are not going to end this by being the most powerful force in the galaxy. We are going to end it by making sure the galaxy knows the truth. All of it. Then we are going to let people decide what they want to do with that truth." Owen Cole looked at me for a long time. "And if it does not work?" "Then we still have the fleet," I said. He nodded once. "We voted. It was not unanimous. 11 people voted with Owen for immediate military advance. 20 voted with me. I understood the 11. I did not dismiss what they were feeling or what they were afraid of. I simply believed we had a better path." We began the release the next morning. Every document Ruth Kane had compiled, along with testimony from 17 council insiders who had agreed to speak on record, went out simultaneously across every communication network accessible to the compact relay system. Council-controlled networks attempted to suppress it within hours. By then, it had already spread through independent channels in 16 systems. Containing it at that point was like trying to hold back water with open hands. The response was not immediate. Truth rarely lands all at once. It arrives in pieces, and then the pieces connect, and then the connection becomes something that cannot be undone. On the 4th day after the release, the Silhari Directorate announced a suspension of cooperation, with the Council pending independent verification of the documents. On the 6th day, the Dravvosi government issued a statement that was carefully worded to say very little, but the fact that they issued any statement at all, given their abstention at the vote, told me the pressure was building from inside. On the 8th day, High Chancellor Vrethka was detained by his own Security Council. I heard this from Ian Ford, who had been monitoring council internal communications from a relay station on the edge of the system. He sent the report in flat, factual language, the way he always communicated. Vrethka detained at Conclave Central by Loreth Security Directorate. Official charge listed as abuse of executive authority. I read it twice. Then I sent a message to Nate Price. Hold all fleet movement, no advances, no positioning changes, let it breathe. On the 10th day, the Silhari delegation sent a formal communication to our fleet's address. Not to the council, not to any government, directly to us. They stated that the Silhari Directorate was prepared to recognize humanity's right to full self-governance and requested human arbitration oversight for the edict review process. They were asking us to supervise their own legal proceedings. The species whose delegate had laughed at our veterans' memorial was asking us to be their neutral arbitrator. I sat with that for a long time. On the 12th day, a transmission came in on the channel I had reserved for one specific contact, the Loreth Governing Assembly, not Vrethka, who was no longer in a position to communicate with anyone. His successor, a young council diplomat named Ora Vale, who had apparently spent the last 2 weeks doing a great deal of reading. Ambassador Voss, she said. She had a careful, precise way of speaking, as if she were constructing something fragile. I want to be honest with you. The documents your people released have created a situation that cannot be managed by anyone in the current council structure. Several member governments are formally withdrawing. Others are demanding complete reform. The institution, as it currently exists, will not survive the next 60 days. I know, I said. My question is what you intend to build in its place. It was the right question. I had been waiting for someone to ask it. Something better, I said. Something that makes what happened to the Marin and the Koreth and the Felhari structurally impossible. Something with genuine accountability. Ora Vale studied me through the screen. You could have taken this by force, she said. You had the opportunity. Yes, I said. Why did you not? I thought about the briefing room, about Owen Cole's 11 votes, about the 4 million names I carried as weight every single day. Because I have read your history, I said. All of it. Not just the parts the council wanted us to see. Power built on conquest requires constant maintenance. It requires continuous force to hold together what force initially assembled. We do not have the population or the inclination for that. I paused. And because 4 million of my people were taken from us by a decision made in a room where we had no voice, I will not build the next governing structure on that same foundation. She was quiet. We need time, she finally said. You have 30 days, I said. After 30 days, I expect a formal delegation at coordinates I will transmit separately. Bring every species still willing to participate in building something new. Bring your documents and your demands. We will bring ours. After the transmission ended, I went to the observation window. Nate Price came and stood beside me without being asked. We had known each other long enough that we did not always need to announce what we were doing. Do you think she will come? He asked. Yes, I said. She is practical and she does not have a better option. I watched the stars. The ones who might have better options are the ones I am thinking about. He nodded, he understood. On the 14th day, I sat down alone in my quarters with a data pad and a blank document. I began writing names. The names of the colonists from the 3 outer belt worlds. Every name I could confirm from the population records Ruth Kane had pulled before they were seized. I did not finish that night. I came back to it the next morning, and the morning after that. I did not set the pad down until every name was written. The conference took place on a station we built ourselves. It was not a grand structure. We did not have the time or the inclination to make it impressive. It was functional and clean, assembled in 30 days from prefabricated modules, with a central chamber large enough to seat 40 delegations and a ring of smaller rooms for private discussions. We placed it in neutral space, equidistant from every major council system, and we called it the first compact assembly. I arrived 2 days early. I did not do this to project authority. I did it because I wanted to walk through every room before anyone else arrived, to stand in the spaces where the future was going to be argued over, and to make sure I had said everything I needed to say to myself before I had to say it to everyone else. Lena Burke arrived with me. She had been at my side since the beginning of all this, quiet and precise and completely steady, and she had spent the last month on the detailed legal work of drafting the compact charter, while I had been managing the fleet and the communications. She handed me the final draft on the second morning, 312 pages, and she had that particular expression she got when she was proud of something but was too professional to say so directly. I read all 312 pages. Some of it I had written myself, in the early hours of mornings when sleep would not come. Some had been contributed by Ora Vale's legal team, which surprised me with both its quality and its honesty. Some of it came from a Dravosi legal scholar named Pell, who had never held a government position and had spent 30 years writing papers that no council official had ever read about what fair interstellar governance should actually look like. Pell arrived on the first day of the conference on a small personal transport, with a carry case of data drives and the slightly dazed expression of someone who had spent a lifetime writing about things in theory, and had just discovered that the theory was about to be tested in the real world. "Ambassador Voss," he said when I met him at the docking arm, "I have to be honest. I wrote most of my work assuming it would never actually be used." "That makes two of us," I said. The delegations arrived over the following 24 hours. 12 came in the first wave, some from former council members, some from non-aligned species who had been watching from a cautious distance for decades. Asara arrived with her flag captain, Helen Gray, who had served as her tactical officer for 20 years and who shook my hand with the directness of someone who had already decided we were on the same side. Asara and I stood in the corridor outside the main chamber before the first session, and we did not make speeches. There was nothing either of us needed to say that had not already been demonstrated by the choices we had made to arrive at this moment. "How are your crews?" I asked. "Ready to go home," she said. "Mine too." We went in. The first session lasted 9 hours. I will not describe every moment because most of it was the careful, painstaking work of building something durable, and while that work is vital, it does not carry a clear dramatic shape. What I will say is that the most significant moment came 4 hours in, when the Loreth delegation submitted a formal admission of the Council's historical crimes against the Marin, the Korath, and the Felhari as a document for the official record. The chamber went quiet when Ora Vale read it aloud. I looked at Ruth Kane, who was seated at the back of the room as an observer. She had spent 12 years collecting evidence that she had not known would ever be formally acknowledged. She was looking at the ceiling, and I could not see her expression clearly, but I saw her hands, and they were very still. The admission became Article 1 of the Compact Charter, not buried in a subsection, not softened with diplomatic language. The first article, because if you are building something new and you cannot say clearly and plainly what you are building it in response to, you are not building it correctly. Article 2 was the rotating leadership provision. No permanent seats. No species that controlled the agenda by default. Leadership positions rotated on a merit-based selection cycle, with an independent review board drawn from non-governmental representatives. This was the provision that caused the most debate, specifically from 4 delegations who had held permanent seats in the old council, and were finding it very difficult to imagine a structure that did not place them at its center. I let them argue for 3 hours. Then I said simply, the permanent seat structure is what made the Edict of Containment possible. If you want permanent seats in this compact, you are building a structure that will eventually produce another edict. If you can explain to me why the benefit outweighs that risk, I am listening. None of them could. Permanent seats did not make it into the Charter. Article 3 established the Species Rights Tribunal, an independent judicial body with genuine enforcement authority, staffed by a rotating panel of legal scholars from 12 different species, with the explicit power to investigate any compact government and override any directive that violated the basic rights provisions of the Charter. It was the article Pell had been working toward his entire career, and when it passed by consensus, he sat quietly for a long time and then said something in his own language that Helen Gray translated for me as, "Finally." The conference ran for 11 days. On the last day, before the final vote on charter adoption, I asked for the floor. I had not prepared a speech. What I said was not the result of careful construction. It was the result of 11 days of watching people argue and compromise and occasionally surprise each other, and everything that had accumulated in me over the months before that. I stood up and I said this. My species has been in conflict with this process since before most of us were born. We came into the galactic community 40 years ago and we tried to do everything right. We contributed. We helped. We built. We trusted. And we were betrayed in a room much like this one by people who were afraid of what we might become. I want to be honest about something. We were not perfect in how we responded. I made choices in the past months that I will examine for the rest of my life. We lost 4 million people whose names I carry with me every day, and nothing built here will bring them back or make that weight any lighter. This compact is not a happy ending. It is a beginning that we arrived at after enormous cost. But here is what I know. Every species in this room chose to come here instead of continuing a conflict that none of us could afford. Every one of you made the decision that the cost of cooperation was lower than the cost of continued confrontation. That is not trust. Not yet. Trust is built over years of kept promises and honest decisions made in good faith. What we have right now is something less certain and more meaningful than trust. We have a shared decision to try. I sat down. The Interstellar Compact Charter was adopted by consensus vote 40 minutes later. The next 6 months were the hardest months of my life, and they looked nothing like the months of crisis that came before them. They looked like meetings, long meetings, document drafting, jurisdictional discussions, questions about enforcement mechanisms that had no clean answers, species who had agreed to the Charter in principle and were discovering in practice that some provisions required them to change things they did not want to change. Nate Price took over Fleet Command permanently. I had told him 3 days after the Charter vote that I was not a fleet admiral. I had only been acting as one because the circumstances required it, and that he should carry the title he had actually been doing the work of. He accepted without any ceremony and went back to his work. Lena Burke became humanity's first representative to the Compact Tribunal Selection Committee. She was exactly suited for it. She had the kind of patience that processes complex problems without visible strain, and a memory for procedural detail that I had never fully matched. Ian Ford, who had spent 11 years as a deep-cover operative on the Conclave station, went home to a small city in northern England where his family had been told he was working in long-haul cargo. I understand the reunion was not simple. 11 years is a long time to explain. I did not ask him the details. What he had done in those 11 years had changed the shape of events in ways that would not fully be understood for decades, and the settling of things between him and the people who loved him was entirely his own. Adrian Cross received a commendation in a ceremony that was not made public. He declined the formal recognition and asked instead that his name be placed on the memorial we were building for the outer colony losses, not as a hero, as a witness. Clara Webb flew the Aliner on its first post-conflict mission, a supply run to 2 of the colonies that had been seized and then released. She sent me a short message afterward. The colonists met us at the dock. Some of them had been told we were a story someone invented. I told them the story arrived in a cargo hauler. One of the children asked if she could see the engine room. I said yes. That was the whole message. It was enough. Asara's 43 ships returned to Dravosi space. She did not go with them. She had been formally separated from her government's military structure when she made her choice to support us, and she knew at the time that return was going to be complicated. She accepted the position of first non-human chief arbiter of the Compact Tribunal. The day she was sworn in, I attended the ceremony. It was brief and functional because that was how Asara preferred things. Afterward, we stood in the corridor outside the tribunal chamber, and I congratulated her. She said, "I am not certain I am the right person for this. You left a government you had served faithfully because you believed in something larger than that government," I said. "That is exactly the quality this position requires." She looked at me for a moment. "I hope you are right." "So do I." We went and stood at the observation window at the end of the corridor, looking out at the stars. We stood there for a while without speaking, in the way that people stand together when they have been through something that does not compress into words. I left the compact assembly station 3 days later. I had submitted my resignation from the ambassadorial corps 2 weeks earlier. It had been accepted without comment, which was exactly the right response. The work I had spent 40 years doing had been aimed at building something that could function without me holding it in place. If it still needed me to hold it together, I had not done it right. I took a standard commercial transport to Earth, not a military ship, not a private arrangement. I sat in a seat that was slightly too small and ate a meal that was entirely forgettable and watched the stars slide past the cabin window, and it was one of the most peaceful experiences I had had in years. I did not return to the capital. I went to a small coastal town on the southwestern edge of England where I had grown up, which had changed very little in the 40 years I had been away. The harbor still smelled of salt. The streets were narrow and old. The people I had grown up with had mostly moved on or grown old, but the shape of the place was familiar in the way that early places always are, carried somewhere in the body below the level of conscious memory. I rented a house at the edge of town, with a long garden that had been untended for several years and needed a great deal of work. I bought seeds and tools. I spent the first 3 days clearing the garden of everything that had overgrown it. It was physical and absorbing, and it asked nothing of me except attention to what was directly in front of me, which was exactly what I needed. On the 4th day, I began turning the soil. On the 5th day, I planted the first seeds. I did not know what I was doing in any technical sense. I had spent my adult life in space stations and political chambers, and my knowledge of gardening was entirely theoretical. I made mistakes. Things did not grow where I expected them to. Things grew where I had not intended. I found I did not mind. I thought about the compact sometimes, in the evenings when the light was going and I was cleaning tools in the shed. I thought about Lena and Nate and Clara and Adrian and Owen Cole and Aura Vale and Pell, and all the people who were doing the difficult, daily, unglamorous work of making the thing we had built actually function. I trusted them, not without question. With the kind of trust that is built on evidence, accumulated over years of watching people face hard choices and choose the harder right path over the easier wrong one. I thought about the 4 million names. I thought about them without drama, which was the only way I could hold them without it consuming everything else. I thought about them as individuals, as people who had woken up on an ordinary morning and made their breakfast and done their work and been fully present in their lives. I held them as weight, not as fire. That was all I could do. I held them and I kept going. One evening, about 6 weeks after I arrived, a child from the house 2 doors down came and stood at my garden fence. He was perhaps 8 years old, with a serious expression and an unsettling directness in the way he looked at things. "My dad says you used to work for the government," he said. "I did," I said. "Was it good?" I considered the question honestly. "Parts of it," I said. "What do you want to do when you grow up?" He thought about it with the complete seriousness that children bring to questions adults ask casually. "I want to go to space," he said. I looked at him. He meant it without reservation. "Good," I said. And I meant that without reservation too. They called us a hazard species, a Tier 0 threat. They looked at our history and saw something ungovernable, something that spread and adapted and refused to be contained, and they concluded that the safest response was to close the box before we grew too large for it. They were right that we are all of those things. We are determined. We are persistent. We remember injuries for a very long time and we plan for the worst even when we hope for the best. but they made their calculation looking only at our worst moments, and they never looked carefully enough at what we do in the spaces between those moments. They did not look at the gardens we plant in broken soil. They did not look at the people who spend 11 years in the dark doing quiet work for a future they may never personally see. They did not look at the children who stand at fences and say they want to go to space with complete and total certainty, as if the universe is simply waiting for them to arrive. We are the species that has stood at the edge of collapse more than once and come back to build something from what was left. We are the species that constructs the institutions we wish had existed before we needed them. We are the species that forgives slowly, argues constantly, and refuses to stop trying. The Galactic Council looked at all of that and saw a problem to be managed. The universe, I believe, is beginning to understand that what they were looking at was something else entirely. We are not a hazard. We are a beginning.